Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking this big stack of sources, historical documents, academic research, and we're going to unpack a question that's, well, it's fascinated people for centuries, hasn't it? The historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth. Our goal here is really to give you a shortcut, a way into understanding the overwhelming mainstream academic view,
Right.
separating the Jesus of history, the one we can reconstruct using historical methods, from the Christ of faith, a theological figure.
Yeah, what's really fascinating, I think, is that this mainstream scholarly consensus, it's been built up over, 2 centuries, and it overwhelmingly affirms that a historical Jesus really did live in first-century Roman Judea. This isn't really controversial within the field.
Yeah.
It's a position held by virtually every, competent scholar working on it, pretty much settled by the early 20th century. Now, of course, details get debated constantly. But two events, they have almost universal agreement: his baptism by John the Baptist, and crucially, his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate.
Okay, virtually every competent scholar. That's a strong statement. But let's say someone listening is still a bit skeptical. What are the absolute, bedrock pieces of evidence before we get into all the details? What sources are historians actually looking at?
Right, good question. Because it's not just one or two things. We're talking about a pretty significant body of evidence, actually. Historians can point to at least 12 independent sources, just from 5 different authors in the first century alone. Some estimates push that number higher, maybe up to 30 sources from 25 authors, which, is quite a lot more than we have for many other notable figures from first century Galilee, whose existence nobody really questions.
That is surprising. And I guess the non-Christian sources are particularly powerful here because they don't have an agenda, so to speak.
Exactly. They're incredibly valuable because they had no vested interest in promoting Christianity. Quite the opposite sometimes. So you take Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the first century. He just casually mentions James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. It's offhand, suggesting Jesus was, just known. And then there's the Testimonium Flavianum. Now, parts of it were likely added by Christians later. Scholars agree on that. But there's an authentic core there that attests to Jesus' existence, his reputation as a teacher, and his crucifixion under Pilate. That part's generally accepted as genuinely from Josephus.
So Josephus, a Jewish perspective, what about the Romans? Did they notice?
They did. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 CE, he independently confirms that Christus, that's Christ, was executed by Pontius Pilate during Tiberius' reign. And what makes Tacitus so compelling is, he clearly despised Christians. He calls their movement a mischievous superstition.
Right.
So reporting Jesus' execution as a fact, despite his hostility, that actually lends weight to it. He wasn't trying to help the Christian narrative at all. And then you have others, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, maybe Mara bar Serapion, even mentions the Talmud. They all collectively sort of corroborate these basic facts: execution under Pilate, existence in Judea.
Okay, this is where, for me, it gets really interesting. The Christian sources. We've talked about external proof, which is vital. But what about the writings by early Christians? Aren't they just, inherently biased? How do historians use those?
That's a crucial distinction to make. You have to read them critically, obviously. But the undisputed Pauline epistles, letters written by Paul, are absolutely foundational. Think about it. These are written maybe 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death. It's incredibly early. And Paul himself says he met eyewitnesses, people like Peter and Jesus' own brother James. He met them as early as 36 CE, just a few years after the crucifixion. Now, yes, his letters are theological, but woven into the theology is a clear outline. Jesus existed, was Jewish, had disciples, was betrayed, crucified, buried. And even before Paul, scholars find these little creedal fragments embedded in his letters, short summaries of belief. These suggest the core story was crystallizing within years of Jesus' death, while eyewitnesses were definitely still around.
And you mentioned the criterion of embarrassment earlier. How does that fit in?
Yes. That's a key tool historians use. Basically, you ask, would someone invent a detail that makes their movement or their leader look bad? Think about the crucifixion. Roman execution reserved for slaves and rebels. Utterly humiliating.
Not exactly a great selling point for a divine figure.
Exactly. So the fact that this embarrassing event is central to all the early accounts makes it very likely historical. They wouldn't have made that up. And the Gospels, though written later than Paul, are seen by most scholars not as modern biographies, but as ancient ones, rooted in these earlier oral traditions going back to Jesus' time.
Okay, that makes sense. But it does bring up the Christ myth theory. The idea that Jesus was entirely mythological. You hear people point to the lack of, say, a direct archaeological find related to Jesus himself. How does scholarship respond to that?
Right, the Christ myth theory. It's important to know that this is widely considered a fringe view in mainstream scholarship. It really doesn't hold much water academically. Proponents often use, well, flawed methods or rely on comparisons that have been largely debunked. Scholars point back to Paul's letters, the non-Christian sources, the Gospels as ancient biography. The evidence for a real person is just too strong. And the lack of direct archaeological evidence for Jesus himself. Honestly, that's not surprising at all for a peasant from first-century Galilee. We lack direct physical evidence for the vast majority of people from that time and place. Records just weren't kept that way for non-elites.
So for you listening, the takeaway isn't that we found, like, Jesus's house keys or something?
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
But what archaeology has done is powerfully corroborate the world described in the Gospels, the historical context. We've found Nazareth was indeed a small village in the first century, just as described. We have evidence of Roman crucifixion methods, like the Johanan find an ankle bone pierced by a nail. And even the ossuary, the bone box, inscribed with the name of Caiaphas, the high priest mentioned prominently in the trial narratives. All these finds lend significant plausibility. They show the setting is real. So the bottom line, the scholarly consensus is really clear. Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person. The combined evidence from non-Christian and early Christian sources creates a very robust case.
And maybe just one final thought to leave you with, something provocative. Beyond all this direct historical detective work we've been talking about, just consider the sheer impact Jesus has had. This absolutely unprecedented transformation in, well, everything. Law, ethics, science, education, sparking movements for equality, even shaping modern medicine. Explaining that kind of profound, enduring, worldwide change is, well, it's pretty difficult if you argue the figure at the center of it all was purely a myth. It strongly suggests there was a uniquely powerful, transformative historical person at its origin. Something to think about.